Well, I'm sure you all come for Emanuel, so I will keep it very short. However, it's a pleasure to introduce Emanuel for the simple reason that both David and myself, we know Emanuel and Christophe for about, I think, 10 years. And I would dare to say it's probably one of the closest friends I have in architecture. We've been teaching together very often, in a sense that never at the same studio, but very often in parallel. We've been working alongside in different projects. But also, I think, and perhaps that's my function here, I don't know, I think when you get to know this gentleman here on my right side, this super elegant presence, as you see, hides, in some sense, I feel, the kind of pragmatic provocateur. And the only thing I could add to what he will tell you, which is of course far more beautiful, far more convincing, is that this one picture, which I took some years ago, or actually a year ago, when the building, the museum, he will no doubt talk about also, in Basel, that I was fascinated by the fact, not of this beautiful grey marble, of course, maybe not even of the grey stucco you see on the walls, which is oddly enough grey stucco on top of concrete. So, you know, the beautiful concrete was there, but it decided to hide it again in something kind of similar, but not really. But perhaps most fascinatingly are these slightly Italian 30s doors you see there, which are gigantic, but are at the same time simply there because they can close and they protect against the fire. So this bizarre, I would say, turnaround of something almost so elegant you would not look any further into something so dry and to the point that you're shocked to get to know this. I think this is very much the Emanuel I know, and that's why I would have liked to do this short introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I don't know in what different directions I would address my gratitude. I'm very happy to be here. I have to say I've had the opportunity to be in this space once with a group of my students, like maybe 3 years ago. And then we had a spontaneous meeting with the director of this institution up there somehow. And then we stayed there for 3 hours or so. It was really inspiring. And I try not to be too much inspired by this just experience. That means I try to be a bit more shorter, and still I like to take you onto a certain journey through our work. So this, actually, I would sit. I was asked in an email whether I would prefer to stand or to sit, and I wrote stand, and then I got this table, so now I sit. All right. So, well, I say it's a funny spatial issue anyway. So I'm sitting here, trying to take you a little bit to the position, the approach of our office that is called Christian Gantenbein. I've actually founded our studio together with Christophe. It's hard to say. It's 19 years ago, I think. So it's quite a while, I understood. And we're still trying and testing. And I take you somehow back to the early days of our experience. Actually, you will then see how all relates with why I'm here today. Or yesterday, and why the title of this lecture is called Objet Trouvé. What I'm showing you here is a book. It's somehow our very first project, although the book was only published, I think, 5 years ago. But it goes back to an experience that was right after university, when Christophe and I somehow happened to decide to work together. And it's a project about finding our own architectural vocabulary, somehow a research in what is our field of reference, or the cosmos, our architectural cosmos that we would refer to. And the book is called Pictures from Italy. And now comes this delicate moment where I dare to quote myself, which is of course a bit odd. actually, Christoph and I, we wrote the text together, and we even wrote it here in Brussels, I remember, when we taught actually a studio together, or a kind of a masterclass in parallel, you remember, with Kirsten. Anyhow, so Pictures from Italy was our first architectural project. Maybe you can read it even from the projection. The pictures were shot in 1999 during a 6-week journey throughout Italy. Like every other architectural undertaking, we internalized this journey so much that our identity as designing architects became fundamentally influenced by these images we took on the journey. We have to absorb previously conceived architecture by studying and understanding it, and one way is by illustration using images. We are convinced, and this is bottom line, we are convinced that a project never starts from scratch, but that on the contrary, creativity is always related to that which exists and that it gains nourishment and inspiration from it. In this regard, our Italian journey was more precisely an illustrative journey with the objective of learning and understanding. Once aroused, the architectural content of this journey's pictures finds expression in one form or another in all of our built architecture. The pictures expressly, their architectural content, have become a basic part of our underlying architectural philosophy. Anyhow, you understood it was a sort of our intellectual honeymoon where that took us to Italy, and that's where our artistic and intellectual debate somehow started, and it still goes back to Italy. And that's why I'm showing you just a series of pages out of this book to start. And these pictures were taken by Christoph and myself, still slides, so I mean diapo. And there is a Renaissance architecture like Palazzo Te in Mantova by Giulio Romano, but also anonymous places like, I don't remember where it was actually, or then Italian modernism, as it has been mentioned. You spoke about the doors in Kunstmuseum, Kirsten, so you see, actually. And then we did a strange thing. The book came out 13 years after the pictures were made. So we found it interesting as a sort of an experiment to confront the pictures from Italy with some black and white pictures of our own work. So the black and white is ours. This is an extension to a family home on the left-hand side in on-site cast concrete, and some cenotaphs in Ravenna on the right-hand side. This is another picture from Italy. It is Rimini, the view from the hotel room. And then you see on the left a workshop we built and an office in a palazzo. I think it was in Bologna. And this you know, Uffizi in Florence. And I'm aware of what it means to show such like pictures, also to you as an audience and to the audience in general by publishing such a book. And going back to this, I'm also getting aware myself. This book can really be seen as a manifesto for a sort of a personal, and through our own work that is somehow playing a role in it, even as a sort of a creative and a very direct approach to architectural history. And if I take it even a bit further, and I state it even bolder, I could say it is a commitment to European culture. And by showing this here, and by trying to also link it to what I'm doing now and what I'm presenting later, I would like to say we care about architectural heritage. And what we try to do is by looking at these buildings, we feel directly concerned, or I think this is actually the point. We have to feel personally addressed and confronted when we look at such a piece of architecture. Because by visiting such a place, I mean, of course, we are tourists as the ones on the picture, no doubt. But what we try, and I think we all should and we all do, and this is something which is great about our profession, is that somehow we are still concerned. It's not a pure academic approach, nor is it nostalgic. It is somehow something that is directly or should be directly related to our work. And that's actually what we tried. Very eager, very ambitious at the beginning, that we went to Italy and we told ourselves we want to be part of it. We want to be concerned. And doing this, it stands in a great tradition of the Italian journey, of course. It is a sort of a cultural act, a very personal one. I think the culture of accumulation of knowledge. And in that sense, such a trip, taking the pictures, trying to, by illustrating, by depicting the piece of architecture in whatever way is an act of appropriation. And this is what education is about. So somehow we teach ourselves by doing so, and I'm still trying to do the same. Of course, we extend our field of research. It goes into different directions, but somehow it always goes back to this type of experience. So this is the tourist and the traveler in Italy. It goes on with another shot from Mantova on the left. So it's actually then through our contemporary work that we link ourselves to the past, to the history of architecture. And I do that deliberately in a very free way here, and it's open to interpretation. But by putting it in such a layout, I would like to underline that we are part of this history, of that long history of architecture and its tradition. And then, if I may, I would quote another short portion of that same text at the beginning, confrontation with the juxtaposition of both series of pictures, the black and white and the other ones. We take the risk of placing the pictures of each pair as if they were in relation to each other. The direct impact of the Italian pictures allows for speculation about its counterpart. We are aware of numerous possible misunderstandings. Of course, it's not as you might think it is. But the reality is, of course, different. There is no direct causal relationship between Italy and our architecture. The book and this confrontation and juxtaposition aims at illustrating our general architectural philosophy and not at delineating an architectural genealogy of our work. We want to express the continuity of the architectural through the coexistence of the pictures. Architecture stays architecture. You can design it anew, but never really reinvent it. Wow, this is heavy sentences we wrote for this comparison here. For example, left is a housing, small residence building in Basel, in my hometown, and on the right, this is Venice, as you know. And I think this is the last of these pairs. On the left is actually the first house that we then actually built after being back from Italy, strangely enough. This is a house on a railway track outside of Zurich in Switzerland. Here confronted to a view of a building that we called the House of the Archaeologists on the Palatine in Rome. And I show you this first project having this journey or being back from the journey to Italy. It is, as I told you, a small apartment building directly on the railway and sticking to the same method of looking at the world and finding images. We went on another journey just around Switzerland and found this type of buildings, a small factory, for instance, that you actually find typically along the railways. And these examples became very important to us while we were designing this first project. And somehow, by collecting these images, we created a system of reference for the project. It was somehow the anonymous of the everyday, the second half of the 20th century, 1950s, 60s, and all in gray. And I got aware while collecting these images that there was a deep interest, and I'll come back to that, into anonymous architecture. Is it possible that we can make anonymous architecture, I mean, as an artistic strategy of an author? We tried, and these are the drawings of the facade, front, side, back. Very directly somehow derived from this inventory of the 1960s office, workshop, or factory buildings. And this is the floor plan, 2 volumes intersecting, slightly manneristic in the sense how they are tilted, but very simple as a plan. It's actually a plan libre. You have a structure of columns, and the rooms are put into that plan or the walls if they came afterwards, so they could also change actually. And here you get a few images seen directly from the train. And this is the interior. Of course, you also understand that then the language, the detailing, has a lot to do with just our everyday surrounding of the time, like the office building from the 1950s we were in, that somehow is directly recalling this, or actually mirrored in the detailing of the house. Right. So making anonymous architecture as an idea is quite interesting, I think. So, and it's not necessarily what we found in Italy, although there is a lot of anonymous architecture, the kind of accidental masterpiece that you would find all along your way through cities. And but then, after a while, we thought it would be very interesting and worth it to research and investigate the topic of, let's say, the big mass of urban architecture in a more systematic way. And that's what we did, and this is the third project, if you want, that I'm showing here briefly. That is a research that we then in the end called Typology. It's another book in a sort of a series, with the first one that was a very personal one, the pictures from Italy. The second one is a book on 4 cities. This is Hong Kong, New York, Rome, and Buenos Aires. A sort of a individual survey, but very systematic, chosen by us and our team, a series, a survey of mostly anonymous, 20th century housing and office buildings mainly in these 4 cities, and actually related to an idea of using them as a sort of a catalog. So the basic question is, looking at these cities, looking at the density, at the mixity, but also at the architectural beauty of it, for instance, Hong Kong. What can we learn from that? Would it be possible or imaginable to use these types or the principle or the architectural features that we find and transfer and transplant them in a way into a different context? And that's what we also then tested with the students. Here you see just a page, I think it is New York. The typological drawings, maybe a bit badly represented here, but then, and the photographs showing that what type of city or what kind of city is produced by these elements. And then what we did with the students, and it's also shown in the book a little bit, is that we did this transfer. And this is, for example, Zurich. And it is an architectural project that is working with, I think, a typological principle that was found in New York. And so the system of reference, in a very explicit way, becomes a working tool, a sort of a catalog. As I said, that also, I think, in the context of our Maniera project that was discussed in the interview. And I think there it gets, in a theoretical way, more interesting, that if we manage to extract the general principles of a building or of an architectural observation, then, of course, we can use this principle. We somehow appropriate it, and we can then use it in our own design. And I would even take it that far that I would say designing is ultimately always an act of transfer and transformation. It's almost impossible to imagine a building, I would say, I mean, could be discussed. It's almost impossible to imagine a building that in a way is not already existing somewhere. That's the only way that we can actually memorize it. And here, this is, as I said, this typological transfer that we did in, let's say, the academic context, but also in our open project. And we took it even further and extended the research to 4 more cities: Athens, Paris, Sao Paulo, and Delhi in India. So that's then even going further. And you see there is the whole catalog. Actually, we also then reactivated a very beautiful text on typology. It's called by Rafael Moneo. He wrote in 1978 and published in Oppositions, I think, at MIT, the first, at the time. And we then found out that it was never translated, for example, into German. So that's what we tried to do also with that book, somehow to also continue this discourse that actually was, of course, very explicit in these years, and is, of course, coming back as well. And here you get an insight in this typological catalog of Paris or Athens. I mean, you see, for example, that, I mean, top left is a housing plan, apartment, residential. All the 3 others are more or less the same size, same urban condition. As you know, perhaps in Athens, it's extremely homogeneous as a urban fabric. Mostly built in the 20th century, small investments. That means it's a very small scale investment and privately owned, which is actually very interesting. I think still is, with all the problems, of course, that they are. And what is interesting is that within that system of these very small units, you would then find very different functions and programs. And somehow what we were very much attracted by is that, for instance, and you see these wonderful drawings, that they even squeezed in parking lots into these very small parcels. And the building, in the end, at first sight, you don't really know from outside whether it's a housing block or a parking. And I think this is pretty interesting as an observation. Anyhow, so this is Athens for the first time. And we might come back to this. And then again, first you have the catalog, and then we have some images that we took in these cities to get an understanding of what is actually then the space and the life that is created or hosted by this architecture. Sao Paulo, Athens, Sao Paulo, I think. And this takes me to another project that is less academic. It's actually just a building. As you can see, this is the model. And in the center, there's a small tower. And somehow I would relate it to the experience of these typological research projects. Why? Because, I mean, in the end, what we found in Hong Kong, what we found in Athens, or in the let's say the new towns of Delhi of the 1950s and 60s, is of course the reality of urban, let's say, of urban production. The city as such is of course a complex set of circumstances, you could say, that then of course are expressed through regulations and other rules. Ultimately, it's all the constraints, also the economical and the social, political and economical situation, as I said, which is having a huge impact on how the city is built. And if we enter a little bit this mindset, then you could say ultimately it's the sheer circumstances, the constraints, the pure constraints of such a moment in such a city, which is actually producing and making architecture. And ultimately it's about form. So the form, and then you see these setbacks in New York. And the truth is, we find buildings and they are more original and more courageous and even monumental or beautiful or whatever you want than what we would ever could have imagined ourselves as authors or designers. So somehow, and this is of course a perverse and a slightly paradoxical thing, that we try to understand to what extent can we learn or somehow imitate the strategy of the anonymous production of the city, and is it really possible? And this project here, in the end, proves it's not possible. But it tells about that tension. I would say it's all about constraints and the harsh urban condition, if there is such in Switzerland. But I don't know. It is outside Basel, so you could say it's not really urban. But still, it's about densification. And what's nice, it's invisible almost on the model here. This is the railway tracks. And this is the main cargo corridor for all the goods that go from north to south. So it's kind of a heavy space, and it's not necessarily where you want to live. And it's a housing residential tower. So there were, let's say, quite a substantial set of constraints. Is it possible? How does the building have to behave in order to organize housing? They're very practical. I wouldn't go that far, Kirsten, that I would talk about pragmatism yet, but it is a very practical problem. How do we organize spaces where you can naturally ventilate and blah blah, all these things, and other constraints, regulations, and we all know that. I guess many of us in this room are architects, and I think it's boring to speak too much about these constraints. But what is interesting and what this model is talking about is, let's say, the power or the influence of these circumstances. In that case, it was, by the way, the angle of these facades, and the one back here that was directly derived from calculations of how you hide from the noise of the train, blah blah, and so on. That's on the one hand. So the specificity of a condition in a specific place on the one hand, and let's say the absolute ideas about architecture like order, geometry, form. And in the end, I think we always negotiate these two, between these two poles, or it's somehow this field of tension. And I'm also saying this because I consider it for ourselves as a certain, let's say, development, that the project in the beginning was more accidental in its floor plan, for example. That's the plan as it then developed. In the beginning, it was asymmetric, it was a bit distorted, and then we felt the need, strangely enough, to straighten it out, to respect all these conditions that I was describing at length. But in the end, it was also about finding a formal principle that gives orientation and a sense to the building. And this is the plan. And again, as I said, there is no real inventions in architecture. Of course, this exists before, but the fan, let's say, the éventail as a principle is of course interesting because it's actually about the plan that is oriented only to this side, protected from the noise. Here is the railway. I hope you follow. Luckily, this is the sun, the south on this side, but it creates like apartments that are pretty deep. Here, I think it's at the upper floors, the bigger ones, and then you see the smaller ones. I'm talking about these 5 apartments with a core that sits not in the center, but at the periphery somehow, like the spine at the back of the tower, which was actually interesting in terms of structure. So it's actually a core and 2 like legs or feet. And it is the tripod that makes it a structure. That's just for let's say, the fundamental question of a tower. And then we have this order of distributing the rooms, and all the rooms are somehow ventilated through here. So this is a window, yes, but it doesn't really open to the side. So trying to find a typological principle that could be generalized, that becomes a type. So somehow, from anonymous architecture at first, that was maybe more a romantic intuition. I'm talking about the grey little factory on the railway. Through the research, a systematic research of the logic of urban architecture, we approached, or we insisted much more in this idea of a typological principle. Ideally, a good project answers all the specific questions that are given in a particular site and program, but ideally it goes beyond that. It becomes something that is a general answer that can become part of the catalog of architectural answers. And going through the plans, you understood, first the housing, the tower, and then the lower part, the socle, is offices, where then we add another rhomboid. I mean, we flip it and it becomes two triangles with a second core here. And that's the ground floor, 2 canopies under these 2 wings and 2 entrances. So actually quite a clear setting. Actually here is then the small square at the station of that town. And here we have it in section. And in elevation, to the south, it's open. We could say it's the beauty of generic post-war modernism. That is still interesting, I think. To the side of the railway, the windows are somehow decreasing. They're getting smaller, and they like close their eyes, or actually ears rather, because of the noise. But so that the building is somehow like a plant reacting to the environment. I could also say, in such a drawing that, of course, was not only produced by these circumstances, it's of course highly designed, but still I think this is the beauty of actually a functional object that then could look like this in a rendering, and that's how we then built it. I think we finished it like a year ago or so. It's clad in galvanized steel, so actually a little bit mirroring and reflecting the light, depending, of course, on how you look at it. And it will also have a patina with the time. Galvanized steel is not completely stable in the atmosphere. So now it's a very shiny technical object that also somehow relates to the industrial surrounding of the place. But who knows, perhaps in a couple of years it rather looks like a tower made out of stone. And there is stone in the interior. That's just, I mean, I think 2 images where you now get an understanding of this specific space when you enter the apartment along this very narrow window. And then the loggia on the corner. Turning to the southern side of the tower. And here we have it in the context of that place. Right, and I would add perhaps another project, still trying to give you a sort of a rather freely improvised lineage of arguments that still can be seen as a sort of a development also in the way how we think about architecture and how we design. And this is a project for on a small campus, designed in the 1950s actually. That's a factory production part that is not in use anymore, whereas here that's a campus with some office buildings and other institutions for a pharmaceutical company called Roche, Hoffmann La Roche. So I mean, it's a Swiss company being, of course, globally present. So and this is actually not in Switzerland, but it's in Germany, very near from where we live in Basel, but still it is the headquarters of the German division. And And this, what is interesting is I was talking about the heritage and the culture of accumulation, and in this case here, it's interesting. It's a company, and they exist since a bit more than 100 years, and they built from the 1930s onwards with Rudolf Salvisberg. I mean, quite an important Swiss modern architect, who then had his successors and established a sort of a tradition. So somehow even a corporate firm, in that case here, understood or half understood that there is something like an added value when you start to respect or remember this architectural heritage and legacy of their ancestors, so to speak. So that strangely led to the sort of, because everything is now, of course, clearly regulated, and there is compliance even in architecture, and so they have the idea that classical modernism, functionalism, very, very, let's say, elegant or minimal elegance is what they are looking for. So even some engineers who are supposed to supervise your design, they know that they have to ask for something like classical modernism, because this goes with the heritage and the identity of the company. And this is an interesting problem, because you don't have only program and economy, but you have like an architectural problem that is set. And we found that extremely interesting. And what we produced was this. It's a small office building, and it's actually even reducing elegant modernism to its absolute minimum. At the same time, it's also questioning its logic in the sense that it is the domino system, you could say. So it's pure structure and tectonics, but in a very fragile and slightly awkward way, because it is stapling or piling up 3 floors or 3 slabs, 4 slabs, all of them slightly different. So it's not just the repetition and the standardized element. It's not about seriality and industrialization. It's rather about creating an object that is defined by these slabs and nothing else, you could say, but somehow contained. It has like a proportion. And so the whole work was a research on creating an object that finds its specific and firm position within that campus, that also is finding the proportion of a building that has a beginning and an end, and even I could say a face. I think every piece of architecture should have somehow a physiognomy, a face. And what we invented here, somehow invented, I don't know, but no, we didn't invent, as I say now, but we just applied the idea of the loggia. And so maybe 20% or 25% of the floor is open, and it's just the loggia facing the center of that campus. So actually, it's a very monumental and very generous gesture that is made towards that side here. Here you see the plan. You also see that there is something like the rhythm is changing of the columns here. We have 3 columns, whereas on that side there are 4 columns. For the rest, the type is very simple. The course in the middle. That's how we then see this part of the loggia between the existing buildings. And that's how the view is from that very space that is this external covered space. And that's basically the project. So now it is about establishing a very clear hierarchy of the base build, that is this white concrete, the black column. And then when you go and here you see the working space. I mean, this is the photographs is taken at the very beginning. Now it's of course furnished and so on. And then when we go into the floor, there is one more element, and this is the carpet. That is then, I mean, somehow in a free interpretation, following the principles also of Sempro, so that you have like the structure, and then the floor or the walls could be the cladding or the textile. In that case, it is then, of course, a removable floor that is showing its, let's say, ornamental qualities with the pattern of different colors in the textile, and some glass sheets that are making different partitions. But in the end, it is an open space office, nothing special. What I think is interesting is that it is not only providing space in that specific place, but it's also negotiating somehow the heritage of classical modernism, and how do we deal with the problem of form? To what extent is this building still speaking the same language as his predecessors? I mean, this is the question. And of course, I would like to take that onto a general level. To what extent are our buildings still able to dialogue and speak with their predecessors, ancestors, was around them? And this is not a moralistic question, and it's of course not nostalgic at all. It's just that I think a good building somehow contains always other good buildings, ideally. And a good building, ideally, is able to establish a relationship that goes beyond the isolated object. This is maybe common sense talking, but it's not that obvious. And it doesn't matter whether it's more like a campus here or in a historical center. I think, and that's also what we learned in these cities where we went and tried to survey and to document. It is always about the interaction between the urban environment and the objects we are designing. Another project related to that problem, but somehow in the inverse way. And I didn't show the pictures, but I could maybe introduce this project by showing the glass house of Philip Johnson. I mean, you might know the icon of modern architecture, so still, but this time the urban environment is slightly different. It's just a garden, but it's actually as urban as it is when it's somewhere here in the streets. But it is a pavilion, a kind of a temporary home in a garden. It's just a box, you could say, or an object, and we don't know really whether it's a house or rather a big piece of furniture, I could say. So somehow this very small, very simple project is about this ambiguity. It's about clarity versus unclarity. It's very symmetrical at first, and then you start to understand perhaps there's two rooms basically, and then one enters not here but here, so that's not completely correct, you could say, and then this is a small kitchenette, and then there are doors that are also walls that could move and hide the kitchen or open up completely, and then on the other side, on the back, there is a very small bathroom, and that's it. So it's one space or four spaces conceived as a sequence or an enfilade of these three layers in that direction and two layers in this. And what we also see, there are shutters, windows to all sides, so perhaps not the most practical floor plan, and this is the facade. And I was speaking about ambiguity, that I consider the most important feature perhaps for architectural form in order to last and to be hopefully intuitively understood. A building shouldn't be too explicit and too clear, I think. There must always be something that you do not completely understand. Is it now somehow a classicist facade with a proportion that reminds you of a design that could be even, I don't know, with the partition of the facade? I mean, the proportion of the window, it's something that I was then sometimes speaking half series of the tout petit Trianon or something like that. I mean, there is like even in the smallest object can be grandeur and high ambitions and aspirations. On the other hand, it's a very casual box. Maybe it's not even a building; it's rather a container or somehow a mobile home that is just finding the ground with this plinth. So it is about this not so clear expression of an architectural object in the sense, does it refer to a code that we know, or is it somehow completely independent as a form, as a formal principle? More concrete, I mean, what you see are sliding windows with shutters, as I said. It's covered with roof felt tar, so this is somehow like a cloth, and you see the joints are precisely composed. And that's actually quite an interesting work of almost haute couture when it comes to build it and to really wrap it with that material. And this is actually, I think, something that is quite important for that object. And here you see a recent photograph of a detail with the entrance door. And the entrance door, for example, is also giving this little, clin d'œil about also the, let's say, physicality of the object. Here we see the roof felt. It's just like a paper or a little bit of a cloth. Of course, it's also very practical in the sense that it makes that it drops the water here, and then we understand this is the entrance door. And then that's how we perceive the object from the entrance from the street. It's in the periphery of a garden, and so you enter like from here. We saw it here. That's a small container, so it's like There are other garages and sheds and stuff, and there is another small garden house. This is like the garden, and this is this. So somehow you also start to understand that in the work of Christian Kantenbein, it's impossible not to react somehow to the context. Somehow, I don't know, we cannot not doing that. And this is actually late 19th century garden pavilion with, it's closed here. I don't know, you don't see anything, I'm sorry. But this is a window closed with shutters. So somehow the principle that you found with our container or our box is somehow already existing there. So we could say these two objects are also somehow entering a sort of a dialogue by all the differences that we find. And now going to that house here or in the center of the garden and looking back, we see this one window that is facing that part of the garden. And I was speaking about physiognomy and the face and the presence of the object in that sense when the windows are open. And this is the interior. It was actually built for an old gentleman who lived in that garden and then reduced somehow the living area and wanted just to have this small place to live, but with his old furniture. And what I liked somehow, it's again pictures from Italy. Maybe it is. It's a plywood palazzo, or at least a model of a small palazzo. So, what is the scale of the building? I don't know. But there is, as I said, always an aspiration of being grand and generous. I think that's something that we should have in every piece of architecture. This takes me to another project that is the extension of the new building for the Kunstmuseum in Basel. Kirsten was speaking about it. As you can see on the right, that's a very early sketch or collage we made at the time. It's like maybe 7 years back. On the right, this is representing the existing museum from the 1930s, and on the left or in the center of the image, we see the new building for a part of the Kunstmuseum Basel painting collection. So it's a building that is mainly or almost exclusively built and conceived for showing paintings. I'm saying this because that's quite surprising. If you look at museum extensions these days, it's mainly observation decks and cafeterias and libraries and multi-purpose rooms, which is all fine. So it's like growing a cultural institution into completely, let's say, general, if not generic programs very often, which is also important because seemingly all these institutions have to grow and to change their habit in a way. And strangely enough, in Basel, the brief was we need more space just to show mostly the collection. And what is important and relevant about that project is mainly the paintings that are in this museum. And plus, of course, some spaces for changing exhibitions as well. But it was a clear conceptual idea, and I have to say that because I cannot really claim it for ourselves completely. It was really the idea to somehow continue or to add more of what's already there in this building here. I don't know who of you knows this museum. It is a 1930s project, as I said, somehow very much conceived in the idea of building a classical museum, even in that case, coming back to pictures from Italy, making very clear reference to public architecture in Italy. That also was quoted at the time. Anyhow, so this is the existing museum. So now a new building across the street, one museum, two buildings is not an easy thing. There should be an underground connection. But still, we have this one institution, one identity also, I think that's important. That was also our position. We wanted to create something that shows I'm new, I'm contemporary, whether I'm a brother or a cousin or I don't know, or an opponent, but still I somehow belong to you, which is already here, which you are already there. So it is about that relationship. And in this vis-a-vis, in this dialoguing across the street, lies, I think, the symbolic value of such a project that, again, I would refer to in a more general sense. I was speaking about the typological rigor. Do you remember? I was speaking about establishing a relationship with the urban context. In that case here, this becomes very, very explicit. It is like at the core of the project. It is that relationship. It's the dialogue between old and new. It is what we call this exchange at eye level. And in the end, this is like the conceptual structure for the whole project. Analogy, similarity on the one hand, difference, distinction, autonomy on the other. I could say, slightly simplifying. And already in this sketch, you understand the new building is more or less, has the same height as the existing one. The colors of the material, although it's maybe a bit different, are referring to a similar palette. You would even recognize windows, proportions of elements that are referring from the new to the old. And I think this is what was guiding us through the project, and that's also what, in a more general sense, I think is what is standing for our position, how we deal with architecture, what is our cultural, our political understanding of our profession. I could say it is about creating relationships in a broken continuity. Of course, today there are 1,000 options. It would also have been possible to state this is a new building, it's a completely different idea, a new idea of a museum. We decided deliberately, we try. I don't know whether we really got there, but that was like the idea and the ambition. We try to provide this museum with a contemporary version of the classical gallery. Anyhow, it's up to you to judge when you're there next, or perhaps you see it a bit in the images. I forgot a bit about the title of the objet trouvé. I mean, you perfectly understood. Our objet trouvé, perhaps first, is the everyday architecture in Italy, besides some great examples of architectural history. Then the objet trouvé is perhaps the housing tower of Sao Paulo. In this case, it's a bit different, but the objet trouvé, or the given object, is this house. And now, how to reinterpret, how to dialogue, how to somehow go on telling the story of what's already there. This was like the artistic strategy. And the building, I mentioned, it has a big courtyard, by the way. So it's really a public building. Many of you might know it. Very rigorous also, I have to say. It's, of course, strictly symmetrical. And that's now how then, in the working model, is the constellation of the two. Here we see the old one with a big courtyard and a small courtyard in the back along this axis of symmetry. And then here, across the street, somehow aligned on that side, you see this side is actually in direct continuity to the front facade of the old building. Whereas this one is then pointing at the bridge that you imagine here on this side. But all in all, it's a completely random form. It sits on a historic plot that was given. There was a 1940s office building that had to be demolished. But it's, of course, it's very much in the center of Basel. Here is the river, the Rhine. And this is like medieval structures, so it's all a bit accidental. You know that, of course, also from here and other places. And how now to create somehow one whole out of these two? It's maybe a bit adventurous thing. That's how it looks then. So from the model to the real. And what we see here is more or less the perspective from the bridge approaching that crossroad here, or that small square. The main building in the center or back here. And this is the extension. I was speaking about this ambiguity of an abstract object that is not really clearly readable in scale and also in articulation of elements. That's like one nature of that object. You could read it as such, but you could also read it as almost a classical composition of a tripartita with a socle that somehow is also indicated in that actually beautiful lateral facade of the old building. Then you have a middle part, and then you have the frieze with the cornice at the top. And it's made out of brick. It's 3 different types or 3 different colors or gray colors of brick. And then the frieze is actually made out of light and shadow. So somebody said it's like the digital age leaving its imprints on the archaic, almost Roman wall that we see here. I don't know, but I mean, it is true. And the wall is a monolithic, actually load-bearing wall. It's not the structure of the building, but it's load-bearing or self-supported wall that stands here, no joint. So we were obsessed with that idea to build a real wall out of bricks. And then here you would have special joints. I don't go into detail, but there we have LEDs. You don't see them. The light source is like hidden. It's only indirectly lighting then the hollow ribs of the joints in between 2 layers of brick. And now, depending on the light conditions, what we see here is a display of text that is actually static ideally, but it can change. And what is lit is actually the interspace between the typefaces. This is lit according to the light that is measured on each face of the building, and what remains is the unlit part that then displays this text. So somehow the building communicates and has this mysterious, somehow a bit strange state of, you don't know, is it a machine? What is it telling? Is it always like that? Did they build it? It's like brickwork, but in a temporary version. I mean, I'm highlighting this because it is, of course, important by referring to such, let's say, traditional technique as masonry, that you find a way to translate it, I think, into a contemporary expression. That's what we tried with that composition of these elements. That's the main entrance actually closed on this image. And you start to understand that the outline of the building, the way it behaves as a physical body, is very directly corresponding with the hierarchy of the different roads and alleys that are somehow meeting at this prominent but a bit chaotic corner. And if we go closer, you get a sense of how the materiality is of that building. I was speaking about the beauty of the blind blank wall, and this is then towards the back where you see how then this somehow still big building is meeting the backyard of that plot. One picture from Italy that I didn't show, but it was very often quoted, is actually the back of the Pantheon. It's a bit Capriccio, but it's the back of the Pantheon that actually was also reworked in the 1930s. And it is this sort of strong presence of just a huge wall confronting, let's say, the normal space of a small street. That is also happening here with a little courtyard in the back. And here we see it then properly from behind, still working on the frieze on the left. And from the front, and here maybe in the most representative representation when it comes to this alignment with the main building that stands here in that road, and it is the sort of the cornerstone at the end of that road. And if we look at it like this in the image, we will also understand in plan. Now we had the perspective from here, how it is related to the main building. Also, we get a sense of the difference in size. It's a very, very compact building. And you understand that one part, this wing is parallel to that road, the other one to this. And that's somehow the typological principle of the building, so to speak. That means the urban setting, the urban space is informing the plan. And in that sense, it's again perhaps pragmatic, and also another attempt of creating a formal principle, a typological idea that is, of course, fundamentally anchored in the condition of the site and I sometimes call it like this butterfly, kind of a slightly uneven butterfly of the two wings, and in that sense, it is also to be seen in an analogy to many actually museum plans that we know, also from the 19th century. The rectangular spaces are the galleries, 4 here in a typical floor and 4 there. And what remains in the center is a slightly more dynamic, if not accidental form, which is the main stairs. And then we have in these leftover parts the poche, where the fire escape and all the technical installations are. So that's the plan. And it goes over 4 public floors, so it's actually more like a vertical museum in the end. So the stair in the center is actually essential. And I take you now through that building, and because in its primary structure, and these are the walls, and they are actually fixed, they are load-bearing. Everything that you see is structure. So that allowed us to take this picture during construction, and somehow, because there is like the essence of the space somehow, I dare to show you these pictures before then you get the full fit out. But somehow already in the ruinous state, the building is somehow there. I don't want to be to insist too much on that, because I don't believe in these rules anymore that a good building has to be a good ruin. But it is interesting that addressing these primary qualities of architecture, the body, the volume, the type, it is satisfying to see it emerge already at that state. The building is there, lit from the top, by the way. And then I show you some pictures when it was newly opened. So it's even some of the artworks were not installed. You see the doors, the famous doors. This is actually in the basement, where you get the perspective into the passage that goes to the old building. Only some artworks are already installed. But you also get the sense of the scale. And this is the huge Damascus gate by Frank Stella, Bruce Nauman then. And this takes us to the stair. We spoke about the material. It's gray marble and stucco, cement. These are the stairs. These pictures are actually taken by Stefano Graziani. So he had did a wonderful series of photographs that also focused on that, on the materiality and the composition of elements, so to speak, that you find in this building. So the marble is from Carrara, and it's somehow strange. It's the most natural thing that you would find in a museum or whatever public building from a couple of years or decades ago. To reintroduce that into a museum is not that obvious, at least not in Switzerland. And not necessarily because it's expensive. It's many other things are as expensive or costly as marble might be. It's not that expensive. But it is, let's say, the formal or the connotation, the meaning, the code. Is this too representative? Is this allowed to reintroduce marble into the context of the art world? And we thought, yes, it is. Also, given the fact, and I'm not justifying everything just by the fact that there's an old building. There's actually no marble in the old building, but it is more about an idea of a building that is somehow opening up its span in terms of time and cultural reference. And what we try here, and what you see there, is a building that somehow is speaking about the fact that architecture, or this type of architecture, could have happened like 200 years ago, or it's now, or it's tomorrow. It's not that important. So addressing time in terms of a cultural idea, but also as a physical or chemical reality, actually. That's something that we try to grasp in that building. So on the one hand, we have this kind of everlasting, noble marble. Why not once more the Italian palazzo or nobility or representative qualities on the one hand, but then combined with this marble, we also have galvanized steel again, and so an industrial material. And of course, we all understand what is the art space today. It's actually, our ideas about art spaces are mainly influenced or actually defined by the experience of the second half of the 20th century, which means it's the industrial space. I mean, that's the place of art production, it's the place of art representation, it's the commercial gallery, it is even new museums somehow, by strange reasons, are just reproducing a sort of a softened version of an industrial space. So somehow the domestication of the industrial rough. And what is interesting is now, and it's also true that many artworks, they somehow need this, at least, or they are created within that context. And this building here has the interesting task to accommodate works from the 14th, 15th century as contemporary or classic modernist, or then 1980s, so whatever. I mean, a huge span of different artworks. And the language that we created in the interior is somehow reacting also to that fact. So we have the marble, yes, the old masters. I mean, I'm simplifying, forgive me. And then we have the galvanized steel that also alters over time. You see the patina, it changes very quickly. It reacts to the atmosphere in the exterior, of course, more than in the interior, but still. So somehow the combination of the two, or of the three, I should say, steel, marble, and then the cement, is actually the palette of these different gray scales that we propose in the public, not in the galleries, but in the public foyers and stairs of the building. In the gallery, then we have. I would say to be honest, I don't know whether it's the white cube. It's not the white cube. It's a space that has a very clear architectural framework. So it's not about abstraction, it's rather the opposite. It's about presence and articulation of the architectural elements, which are in that case a floor. The floor has a structure, a certain seriality of an element. There is a ceiling, as you could see, or as you see here. And then there is the frame of the door, which is actually the load-bearing wall that you see, and that's it. So it's the presence, the tectonics of the space that are expressed. And it's not, let's say, the attempt of making the architecture disappear, which you actually never can. I mean, this is the so-called neutral or abstract space doesn't exist. In the end, your, I don't know, fire or smoke detector or whatever is always there, the cameras and ventilation. So somehow what we try to do is to create a real environment for art that is quite robust. And it's not that every curator would immediately love it, because we are so much used to the fact, for example, les embrasures, I don't know, that the frame of the door should be painted white. It's normal, isn't it? But if we walk, by the way, through Beaux-Arts, for example, it's not that everything is that straightened out. So even contemporary or even more contemporary formats of art could deal very, very well with such a context. This is the galleries. Just a few works before everything was installed, and then especially in that view, we're coming back now to that relationship, that there are also windows. Luckily, there are windows, even though they're sometimes closed. We have this direct view, and we understand that somehow we are still in the same museum. It is about, but at the end, it's about the artwork and the place in the city. So somehow we try to introduce these windows, because it is about not only orientation, but it's also about memory. Where did I see this piece? It is Basel, it is that specific context. So somehow the city appears from time to time as a sort of a framed image on your parcours through the building. But I would say it is a building and a museum that is clearly making the point for a place of concentration. It is really almost, you could say, it's a quite introverted building, a place where you go to see the artworks in that immediate or in that direct confrontation. It is, and in that sense, it's quite a statement nowadays, because we're not necessarily used to that anymore, that you have this building that is really insisting on this direct encounter. I'm saying this because I also learned through the whole work on museums that, of course, we have a whole and a very clear history on museums. I mean, I'm simplifying, we could say the public museum was like invented in the 19th century, roughly, and then, of course, together with the social and political development, it became also the place of the elite. The question arises already in the 1910s. I mean, to what extent is art actually still to be presented in the museum, or the other way around, is the museum still the right place to show and display art? So somehow the format of the museum is of course heavily challenged also by political and social ideas. I mean, do the people have access to that art, or is it a restricted area for the bourgeoisie or the upper class, you know, that is kind of trying to still keep up an old idea of culture that comes from the 19th century. And then, I mean, again, running through the history, we would arrive somewhere in the 1960s, of course, then with a concept like the Centre Pompidou, that of course also has its predecessors already in the 40s and 50s, but then with the Centre Pompidou, ultimately the Centre Culturel as a concept is created, which is of course a huge success, and still, I believe, one of the greatest places to experience art and culture in all its different formats. But what changed since then, luckily, and this is interesting, and this is also what I try to introduce or to reintroduce in the course of that museum in Basel, is that by the time that art is now everywhere and like almost over-present, and of course we have luckily there is no problem of accessibility anymore. Art is everywhere, culture is somehow everywhere. Of course, still we have to fight for it, and we have to somehow carry it into the streets. But it is a completely different situation. I mean, everybody knows all the artworks, and it's like everything is almost art. By the way, it's also getting very, very commercial, as we all know. So somehow to come back and say, okay, the Centre Culturel or the flexible open format of a Kunsthalle is of course one important element or institution, but the museum, the painting collection in that almost traditional sense could become again extremely interesting, almost a provocation to the way how we actually physically and mentally experience art. Not all formats of art, but some. And in that sense, that was the clear mission statement. Somehow, to be honest, I only understood on the way doing this project that this is the almost revolutionary kind of touch to that project, because it's about this. What you see on that projection here on that slide, and it excludes a lot of possible options, but at the same time, it is very intense in that one particular way of presenting and perceiving art. And this, I think, is the last slide of the Basel Kunstmuseum, where we have, in this situation here, an installation by Jeff Wall. And then I try to speed up a little, which I will, because that's simple. That's a new or not a new project, but it's an unbuilt project, and it's very similar somehow to Basel, although there are, of course, differences. We are in Cologne. It's a project, as I said, that's not built yet, but it's on its way. It's an extension again, a freestanding independent building again. Here on the right-hand side, you can recognize the Wallraf-Richartz Museum. So it's built by Oswald Matthias Ungers, opened only in 2002, so quite a late Ungers building. And it is the museum of this mainly, let's say, medieval up to 19th century painting collection that is quite significant. And this is the extension building that we propose. Ungers had it's actually a beautiful project. It is a very small museum, a public ground floor and then 3 gallery floors, and in the back you have the workshops and the offices. And Ian Hamilton Finlay did this work on the facade in collaboration with Ungus. So this is like, let's say, the object to start with. And here you get some sketches, how then we propose or imagine, again, it's just gallery building, so it's somehow quite similar to Basel. This is a small street, and that's the given site. I'm not sure whether you see anything, but I mean, somehow sketches, you never know whether you see anything. So, but it's the box that stands in that site, and what is actually the question is, how does this building that is also related through the underground, how is it communicating or actually interacting with the urban space that is here, a small square? And this took us to the question of how to treat the Sockel, coming back to, let's say, the basics of the profession when I'm speaking about composition, how to structure such a volume and how it is related to the topography. Then we thought it's rather unlikely to just open it up completely and to glaze it, no? Because somehow there is something like tectonics and the weight of the closed body that we imagine in brick. So how is it touching the floor and at the same time dealing with this idea of opening up? And what we developed is actually, we took the 3 names of the founders. I mean, Wallraff, Richards, and then the last one made a huge donation to the institution only, I think, 20 years ago. But so these are somehow the names that are carrying the institution, and it's of course a bit a literal translation of this idea, but what you can recognize hopefully in the drawing is that here, in a way translated into a structural element of columns, we would have the types, I mean the letters of these names that are somehow then sinking into the ground or rather appearing from the ground. And this is then partly glazed here and closed there as a relief, which then carries the wall above. And now just running briefly to the drawings, you see on the right-hand side the new 3 floors that we are proposing, 3 galleries just stacked like this, and here the Ungus building. It's really, I'm sorry, the projection is a bit weak here, but we get the sense. It's a very simple section. The public part with the galleries, and then in the back delivery and workshops that are filling in the courtyard. And what you also can recognize is, and I think this is particularly interesting, is that in this case, we even build somehow the urban immediate context as well. So it is really not only about the museum, but it's about, you know, perhaps about Cologne, having of course also the history of reconstruction after the war, and all this, let's say, huge problem of rebuilding the historic city that even has Roman foundations, but somehow most of it is destroyed or still not really reconstructed. And here was then a 1950s warehouse that was destroyed, and now we rebuild somehow the small-scale fabric of that historic center of Cologne in that site. And here we have some residential build. I mean, it's just some apartments. This is a small office and atelier building that somehow are completing then the whole composition of this project. And this is the typological representation of the floor plans, the gallery, the public stairs, the lift, atelier. That's an existing building. This is a new building with just a small townhouse. And here, the apartments, and in the courtyard, the, let's say, back of house elements of the museum. And here we have it in the wider context. That's our project, and this is the project by Ungus, which I consider an extremely beautiful lesson in terms of a typological project in the context of the historic city, how it deals then with the ruin of a bombed church that was partly rebuilt after the war, and the medieval public building on the southern side of that same block. So this is, and in between we have some a concert and conference hall built by Rudolf Schwarz. So that is a quite impressive agglomeration or conglomerate of important architecture, public architecture in that I would say in general, and also for Cologne in particular. This is the model of our project, and this is then how we imagine it to become part of that immediate context. That's actually why I'm here. Huh? It's now an hour and 20 minutes, so 5 more minutes and then we're done, I hope. We had the idea to have this lecture on the occasion of the opening that was yesterday of our work for Maniera here in Brussels. This is our work. This is Bojan's. So please don't confuse. I think it's an amazing piece, but it's we are a bit more dry here on that invitation. And what is interesting, of course, to us, we spoke about in the leaflet that you have, so I don't have to repeat the conversation that's printed there. But I mean, maniera meaning, okay, what is your manner of doing? What is your way of thinking and working? And please express it in a piece of furniture is quite a challenge, at least for us. It was quite an interesting, but I have to admit also quite difficult task or assignment. How do we actually work and think? And then, of course, you can start to insist and you start to ask, who am I? And am I really an architect? And will I be ever able to design a piece of furniture? And so on. And actually, then for a moment, I would I return to that book that you already saw at the beginning an hour ago. It is, so we go back to our system of reference of anonymous architecture. And what we did, and this is interesting because we thought, I mean, this is actually what we try to do. It's highly manieristic, perhaps, or even perverse. We try to achieve the almost classical beauty of an anonymous technical object, something like that. This is what we try to do with our buildings. We try to achieve a state of, let's say, self-evidence in the everyday of urban life. With all the ambition of designing, composition, but ideally we would get somewhere there. So now, how can we possibly translate this onto the fabrication or the conception of a piece of furniture? And what we did was quite strategic. We went back to actually the raw material of the research of these books, and we browsed through the photographs, and we said we were kind of chasing buildings. We were looking for buildings, but we saw many pieces of furniture as well. Maybe they were part of that architecture, maybe not. And so we tried to find not only our inspiration, but somehow perhaps our project in the context of our books, which are the anonymous maybe, let's say, Mediterranean or kind of Mediterranean city of the 20th century. And to make the long story short, among others, we found this photograph. And in that kind of typology context. And what we found is this table on the fish market in Athens. And we were extremely fascinated by it. And it was really, I mean, particular by that one, I have to admit. And it is a cutting or chopping block. I learned the bio, I think, in French, so where you cut and chop the fish or the meat. So it's actually not that original, we know that, but it means that the wood is put in the vertical position that you have, that you can cut it without breaking the fibers. Anyway, so the only thing we had was this photograph. So we tried to understand the object, to really understand how it is assembled. But what we actually saw is less the function. We only understood, of course, then by trying to read it correctly. But what we saw first was somehow a purely tectonic object. And somehow the imagination, how these pieces are assembled, was something that was inspiring us or triggering a design process. And we thought perhaps out of this image or the interpretation of such an image, there might be a series of a table or a stool or something that could be created out of it. So, and it was, of course, also, I have to say, that's maybe la déformation professionnelle as architects. We looked at these objects, and to be honest, we almost saw buildings. And something like between the anonymous 1960s and the Parthenon, of course. I mean, there is the Parthenon in this object. I would clearly pretend that. Because, I mean, it is, in the end, also in the temple and its frieze. It's the tectonics of the assemblage of elements. And by the way, as we perhaps also know, I mean, I never know whether it's a theoretical myth or whether it's proved, I don't know. But I mean that the temple, the Greek temple originally was built, or the first versions were built in wood, and then it was somehow translated or transferred onto stone. I mean, I think it is Choisy, among others, who described that theory of the change of material. And so you can see, we had just had this image, but that was actually inspiring our imagination. And of course, the fundamental question is it allowed just to take this as the start of the design? I mean, is this still authorship if we just somehow redraw it without measuring? It's not a copy, with just a photograph, but we start to make that drawing. We thought it could be a piece of furniture, who knows? And by producing a second and a third drawing and going beyond just the first representation, I would say we already started the design process. So clearly it's not an anonymous piece anymore. And it is perhaps the objet trouvé, although, I mean, if we go into the definition of the objet trouvé, I would say, I mean, the objet trouvé in the context of surrealism is then, of course, the mystic object that is maybe also from a different culture we don't understand, or with a personal history. So it's all the imagination that is also behind the object. It's not just the form or its physical presence. And then, of course, we shouldn't confuse the objet trouvé and the ready-made, although, I mean, both were strategies exactly that moment when also the museum was somehow challenged as an institution. The art format as such is challenged, and we all know, or you know much better perhaps than I do, about the whole development that was somehow created with the objet trouvé and the ready-mades throughout the history of the arts. But here I think somehow it is related. From the moment on, we choose an object and we try somehow to appropriate it by representing it, by reinterpreting it. It becomes our own. And as you hopefully start to understand, what I'm trying to prove here with a simple stool or table is somehow representative of how we think that we deal with architecture in general. Anyhow, so these were the drawings, and then I have to admit, not very modest, we called them first, I think, Athens Temple series. But then we went on, we built the first model, and we immediately understood it's just this assemblage, or this of the single wooden blocks held together with a stick that is somehow protruding the whole. But we also understood somehow that the way we looked at it is still more the one of architecture. And somehow what you will see, or what you have seen perhaps, or will see at Maniera, is maybe it's a model of architecture. So the furniture is small architecture. And in that sense, that's also something I understood. To make furniture is much more monumental than any building, because somehow it is a generalization of form, and it also potentially can be repeated and reproduced in series. And in that sense, it is ambiguous again, that it is somehow even more present than a building. And what we do here is we play with that idea of the scale and that double nature of a piece of furniture that actually, or perhaps in that composition, becomes something like an architectural artifact that is not necessarily related to the question of function directly anymore. So you could say maybe a furniture designer or an industrial designer would much more relate to the idea of the function or the movement of the body. I'm not saying this is not a criteria, but we conceived it from that idea of composing a series that is something between a piece of furniture and a piece of architecture. And that were just some drawings, and I think this is the decisive drawing. That's how we understood the piece is actually created or held together. You have these independent object elements, and there's no glue and no nails or screws. It's just these wooden sticks that then would and holes, so they are drilled, and then you just push them through. And that's how it holds. So it's somehow stable and unstable at the same time. We also then understood that was not the truth. The original object were constructed in a bit a different way. So it's a misunderstanding. And I'm so glad, and that's also why I'm really telling you, because ultimately there is a moment of transfer and transformation where our imagination of tectonics somehow went beyond reality and created something that is slightly different and new. So lucky us and lucky Maniera. Anyway, and then that was the moment when we had our friends from Brussels here in Basel at the table where we proposed. You see here is even the Parthenon. So we tried really to convince ourselves with all means. And then we had a first prototype. And here ergonomics are coming back, and so we took it seriously. This is, by the way, Christoph. And then it's a question about height and proportion, and this is the process. And then we understood, Kirsten was mentioning the concrete that is covered with cement stucco. With this idea to create the ambiguous object that is maybe a building, maybe a piece of furniture, we had this idée fixe that it has to be covered with a sort of a crépi, so it's stucco that is then sanded off. So the whitewash, that is again making a reference to the Greek temple, if we are not too modest, or maybe just to this object that is not completely revealing its materiality, was something that we were then testing here, and then it was taken a step further. That's the principle of assemblage. It needs a hammer. We understood. And some additional features that I don't explain in detail. What is very nice is that there's also then a wedge that is actually giving the let's say certain tension to the ends of these rods or the sticks, so they are really stable and it doesn't move anymore. So it's in terms of craftsmanship an amazing piece of work, I have to say. That is then treated in an almost Cy Twombly manner, in order then to become these objects. I understand. You know what? At the beginning, I could have asked that we switch off the lights. But you could also have told me. I'm sorry. But anyway, so it is white, but it's less white than on the projection. Anyway, so that's how then these objects are taken to the gallery space just down here. We produced 3 types, a low table, a high table, and a stool. And that's how we can see them from the street, in combination with a beautiful work by Bojan Sarcevic. And that's actually his piece. It's so and we were speaking about ambiguity. It's not that he is much less ambiguous than we are. It's very beautiful. And that's the other part of the gallery space. And of course, you ask yourself, what is it now? Is it a piece of furniture, and how is it exactly treated? And I think this is ultimately what is at stake here, that we start to question the ways of how design works. So I would close and say that somehow it worked well. This Maniera edition reveals more than I thought who we are and how we work. And I want, or maybe no, I don't want to say whether this is a success or not, but at least in that sense, for me, it's quite an interesting and exciting experience. And it also allows, and this is somehow the more serious closing, that to tell you somehow through that work that we see design always as a process of interpretation, reinterpretation, wrong interpretation, translation and transformation. And in that sense, I'm very grateful and want to thank you all to have offered us the opportunity to show and to share this with you here in Brussels. Thank you very much.